Good morning, guys, or good afternoon, or whenever it is that you are choosing to watch this. Thank you so much for choosing to watch this on your own time to figure out how we're connecting the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. So we're going to start with the end of the Revolutionary War. Woohoo! The United States of America is born. 13 states is all we have. Plus, if you remember, we also own the Ohio River Valley Territory. We just haven't done anything with it yet. Here's where you're going to learn how we go from 13 states leaning toward the 50 states. We won't make it all the way to the 50 states before we stop and talk about the Civil War, which is the next major war that we're going to talk about. The video will stop every now and again, and it will have you do some different things, watch some different videos, and go back to videos. So it'll be a bunch of different stuff. So thank you again, and here we go. So the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States of America is born, 1783. As we talked about, after the failing Articles of Confederation, men from Congress, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, they became part of this constitutional convention to make a new rule book for our country. And they worked really hard, and they talked about many different issues like slavery and how many people are going to be part of Congress depending on the size of your state, and how much power would one person have versus the states have. So there's a lot of discussion, and they ended up writing a magnificent document, the Constitution, the rule book for our country, which is still around today. The smartest thing that they did was they allowed the Constitution to be changed as changes needed to happen, and those changes were called amendments. So now we have the Constitution. Our country is finally pulling itself back together since we were a hot mess after the war ended. And part of the Constitution says we need a president. And so 2 years after the Constitution was written, they elect the first president of the United States. Something you may not know is that the vice president that was elected was John Adams. So it was President George Washington and Vice President John Adams. And George Washington works really hard as president from 1789 through his first term through 1793, really just trying to pull the United States of America out of a mess. And he did a magnificent job. And as he was kind of fixing our broken country, about 4 years in, it is time for him to go up for re-election. And so in 1793, he is re-elected for a second term. And one of his main goals for his new term of office is to build a new capital for the United States of America. Again, the capital is where Congress and the government works from. And so each state has their own capital. Each state has where their own Congress, where their governor works from. But we need one for our country. And there wasn't one at this point. Up until this point, they were using Philadelphia. But they thought that Philadelphia served really well during the war, but they wanted something fresh, something new, something for our brand new country to call their own. So George Washington was given the job of building a new capital for the United States of America. And it was not an easy job. He literally had to build a city that would last forever. And so a little bit about Washington, D.C., which is what they called it. First of all, where they decided to build Washington, D.C., since our country is this space here in red, our 13 states, they wanted to build Washington, D.C. kind of right in the middle, right in the center of what our country is now, was then. Now, if you think about it, our country now is this big thing here. They didn't know that at the time. Right now, Washington, D.C. is certainly not in the middle of our country, but then it was. And so what they decided to do was they kind of carved a little place out of Maryland and a little place out of Virginia to turn into Washington, D.C. And here, Washington set out to have some very important buildings built. This monument here is the beginning of what is now a very tall monument called the Washington Monument, obviously to honor George Washington himself. This right here is the building where Congress would work from. And so this is sort of the early building of the building that Congress would work from in our nation's capital. And then here, this is what was the first White House. Although back then they didn't call it the White House. Back then they called it the President's House. And the President's House was George Washington's baby. Like, he was so excited to plan this building and to make it just right, like as a place for honor for a president to be living in. And so he worked very hard to plan it and then to have it built. An interesting story, the White House that you see today is not the White House that you're looking at here, because our White House did get burned down, which we'll talk about later in one of the videos. But this was the original president's house, or White House as it's called now. Just a little bit about the name Washington, D.C. for our nation's capital. Obviously, the Washington part was named after George Washington. I mean, he deserves it if you think about all that he did to make our country, and now this is his plan, is to build this capital. But a lot of people don't know what D.C. stands for. D.C. stands for District of Columbia. By calling D.C. a district, you're basically saying, in a Captain Obvious way, hey, this is not a state, it is just a city. It's not a state, it doesn't have its own state's rights, it is just a city. And then the Columbia part was named District of Columbia to name and honor someone. So we're going to stop the video for a minute. You're going to take a couple trivia questions and see what you might know about some interesting things about Washington, D.C.